Welcome back to Humanities 2. I'm C. Ivan Spencer and I'll be your professor today. Today we're going to look at Sigmund Freud and we're going to talk about how he comes up with almost an entire worldview of the human psyche and of human nature to cope with what he sees to be the naturalistic human condition. So Freud, everybody's heard of Freud. He really needs no introduction. But his ideas are somewhat difficult to understand sometimes, and they get deep into human psychology. And so here, let's look at some of the main themes that we'll see today. We'll look at his understanding of human nature itself. Then we'll look at the whole school of psychology that he began called psychoanalysis. And then we'll look at his view of religion. He says an awful lot about religion. He came from a Jewish background, and so he went to great lengths to try to explain religion. We'll look at the idea of eros, that is erotic desire, and thanatos, the death wish, or violence. These two parts of our human nature being the engines, in a sense, that drive a lot of what we do. And so this is a big part of his system. Then we'll briefly discuss the Oedipus complex, something that he's notorious for, and something that nearly everyone finds to be just a little bit off-putting, to put it mildly. Next, we'll look at how civilization sacrifices individual happiness for peace and order. And in our reading today, Civilization, Its Discontents, will carry out that theme far more. And then there are far more Freudian themes that we cannot fully explore here today, though they might be mentioned, such as his views of the prehistory, going back into deep historical times. He wrote a work on this called Totem and Taboo. Also his theory of sex and his theory of humor even. And also his claims about Moses, learning monotheism from Pharaoh Amenhotep IV. In his book, Moses and Monotheism, that we'll briefly discuss. So why Freud? Why would we include Freud in a humanities program and studies? Well, in the humanities, Freud still has some leverage, even though in the world of sciences and in psychology, his influence has waned some. So it's kind of odd that some of his most fierce supporters are in the humanities, especially in English departments and other areas of literary interest. Many powerful ideas have come into our culture through various men and various areas of study, and not all of them are philosophers, believe it or not. A lot of different thinkers have contributed heavily to our culture, and ideas that philosophers then pick up and develop and so forth, but they themselves were not philosophers, at least not in the modern academic sense of what we think of as a philosopher. So some were ancient thinkers, but not exactly philosophers. Some were theologians, mathematicians, astronomers, biologists. You've seen a lot of these in this course. So Freud will kind of create his own meta-narrative or his own worldview that will deeply influence the 20th century and 20th century culture. His psychoanalytic theory and its view of human nature reaches far beyond the academic discipline of psychology and its practice. Broad cultural absorption and expression of Freud's ideas can be seen in as diverse places as many Hollywood movies, novels, plays, and even in pop culture. So before we delve into his ideas, let's talk about who was this guy. You can't really understand his system without understanding something about his life, because his life and his ideas intermesh, like many thinkers. Well, anyway, he was born in 1856 in Freiburg, Moravia, at the very edge of the Austrian Empire. He was the oldest of 7 children, and Sigmund grew up in a very large extended family as the favored child. It was a Jewish family, and when he was a very young boy, his father fell into very hard times economically and really never ever recovered from that. But in an attempt to survive financially, they moved to Vienna when he was 3 years old. And living there in a Jewish kind of ghetto situation, Freud's family would struggle on in poverty for the rest of his life. Now, Freud himself will be able to, once he enters into the professional world as an MD, a doctor of neurology, he will enter into a kind of a middle-class lifestyle himself. But Freud's Jewish faith and culture struggled to exist in this world. It was a very strong Catholic society. And so he was exposed to Christian ideas and was fully aware of the Christian worldview. But young Sigmund would be taught at home mostly, at least up until he was about 9 years old, learning to read using the Bible and learning to read both in Hebrew and in German. His two favorite figures in the Bible were Joseph and Moses. And throughout his life, he's going to reflect upon them, and he's going to, at the very end of his life, write that book, Moses and Monotheism, which we'll talk about later. So, in some ways, their lives, the lives of Joseph and Moses, influenced Sigmund's, especially Joseph, who was known as the interpreter of dreams. And what is Freud's magnum opus? It is the work, The Interpretation of Dreams. He sees himself perhaps somewhat as a modern-day Joseph, one who is going to peel back the layer of the human psyche and look into the dream world and give us deep insights about ourselves, much the way Joseph did. At about 17, Freud would attend the University of Vienna, and there he would study medicine. He was deeply influenced there by the academic culture that was atheistic, materialistic. His professors there followed a rigorous scientific method. By that time, about 1870s, most European universities have fully accepted the ideas of Darwin that we've discussed before, and a full materialistic, if not full-on atheistic worldview was common in these higher academic circles. In the latter half of the 19th century, science will just steamroll over religion in many ways, especially post-Darwin, and explain away much of the religious viewpoint, the religious understanding of human nature and of the whole cosmos. As one thinker has said, it was a shift from thinking about the world as a cosmos to thinking of the world as a materialistic universe. Universe and cosmos being different conceptions of what everything is. So Freud is definitely going to join into these ranks of these scientists and become a hearty supporter of a full-blown materialistic worldview. And he will interpret it from a Darwinian naturalistic perspective. Freud says, quote, "I felt an overpowering need to understand something of the riddles of the world in which we live, and perhaps even to contribute something to their solution. I came to know all the fields of science, but to which of them I would choose to dedicate my life?" That was the great question. Where would he put his life and dedicate his life? He was very ambitious. He aimed to make a difference in the world. Now, he briefly entertained going into law, quickly chose medicine, but of course, which area of medicine he would go into was not clear. He wanted to pursue an academic life, in other words, to become a professor. But that was kind of closed to him because of his Jewish heritage, and it was just a very difficult thing to do. And so eventually he will be pushed into medical practice. By 1875, Darwin's naturalistic ideas had dominated the University of Vienna, and Freud fully accepted them, as did nearly everyone else of any consequence in the academic world. He was drawn to rebel against the Christian worldview of the broader culture, the Roman Catholic view, and its views of human nature. Freud begins to understand and study humanity from this purely materialistic perspective. And thus, any type of metaphysical speculations, appeal to transcendence, God, anything like that, are just intentionally disdained and shunned in these fields of study. So, influenced by the materialistic philosopher Feuerbach, and later perhaps Nietzsche as well, Freud absorbs many of the avant-garde ideas of the late 19th century. Now, always a man of science, Freud will also develop an intense interest in the humanities, and many of the books that he will write kind of cross over into areas of the humanities, for example, the totem and taboo, going back into prehistory and trying to explain how humanity emerged from prehistory into civilization. For example, a famous quote that is usually attributed to Freud on this is that he said that the first man who hurled an insult instead of a spear is the man who founded civilization. The idea being that humanity started to move away from just sheer outright aggression to dealing with each other in a different way. And so, anyway, he will write many books and articles on all kinds of topics that cross over into the arts and into the humanities and so forth. And he aimed to wed all of these together into a kind of a comprehensive worldview. In 1882, Freud followed Brücke's advice to start a medical practice. This was one of his professors. Instead of seeking an academic career, which had been closed off to him for political reasons. So Freud starts his career as a neurologist, dealing with patients with neural issues, people who might have some kind of a pain in an extremity or a headache or something like that, dealing with neurological issues. And so people might just come into him, he's an MD, and he would deal with these type of issues and try to find what was wrong with the person. But some people, he noticed, began to have psychosomatic problems. In other words, there was nothing wrong with the person physiologically, and so their pains had to come from some other source. Sometimes these were phantom pains. So Freud wanted to discover the cause of these pains that could not be physiological. In 1882, Freud finally married because usually the kind of process was you don't marry until you have your professional life in order, and that was the case with Freud. He marries Martha. He had courted her for 4 years, and within 9 years they will have 6 children. He has a very large family. Eventually he'll become a grandfather later on, and he pretty much operates like a paterfamilias. He loves his big family and his wife dearly. Much of the study and writing over his life led to a very prolific career and founding of the whole psychoanalytic school. Though there are many low points that we're going to see, he did have a very prolific and productive career writing many books. He continued researching and publishing up to the end of his life, but in 1933 Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and Nazis in Austria, where he lived, were emboldened to act against Jews increasingly. And even though he was not a practicing Jew, he was ethnically Jewish, as was his wife. In March of 1938, the German Nazis invaded Austria and captured Vienna. And later on, his wife was brought in and questioned by the Nazis, but released later on. But this was enough. It was upsetting enough. And there were many things that were being done against Jews at this time that the Freuds suffered great distress and finally found a way to escape. By June of that year, Freud and his family left for Paris and finally for London. And it's there that he would write his final book, Moses and Monotheism. This book disturbed many, many people, and it has a somewhat disturbing thesis, the idea being that Moses gets the idea of monotheism. He's an Egyptian who gets the idea of monotheism from Amenhotep IV, a pharaoh, often considered a heretic pharaoh. But Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, and then they kill him. Okay, and so this is a fairly disturbing thesis, but that's somewhat the upshot of the book. But it was his attempt to explain why there was so much animosity and violence towards Jews throughout history. And it does get into the psychology of anti-Semitic behavior. At this time, he had been suffering for almost a decade due to a cancer of the mouth. Freud was a notorious cigar smoker, and nearly all of the pictures show him holding a cigar, or at least most of the famous pictures do. And he had cancer of the mouth, and many operations have been done to take those cancers out, and he lived with a great deal of pain and used cocaine to try to kill the pain at the time. And so he finally dies in London, September 23rd, 1939. His ideas will go on to radically change the secular view of humanity and how to cope with the malaise of the modern condition. All right, so some of the key figures that we will look at here, or that we will be mentioning today, of course, Sigmund Freud, but Ernst Barucha, a professor of physiology at the University of Vienna, who deeply impacted Freud. Jean-Martin Charcot is a famous French neurologist who helped Freud use hypnosis. Hypnosis was being used for therapeutic purposes to help people get rid of certain psychosomatic conditions and other things that they had, but he would go and study under Charcot in Paris to help to eliminate what are known as hysterias. Now, hysteria is simply a kind of phantom pain or some type of neurological pain, or maybe an anesthesia that someone might experience, but it has no real connection to anything physiological, no injury or trauma or anything associated with it. It was called a hysteria because that is the Greek word for uterus, because usually it was women who manifested these type of scenarios. However, men had these scenarios as well, but often simply never went and sought any kind of help for it. So that's how it got its name. Another person is Joseph Breuer, a fellow researcher that worked with Freud extensively and helped Freud find a key patient for the founding of the psychoanalytic theory named Anna O. She will become kind of the founding patient of this whole school of psychoanalytics that Freud and Breuer will develop. Also, a couple of other followers and friends, Alfred Adler, a Viennese physician, and one of his principal disciples, Carl Jung, who will later on develop his own views of psychoanalytic theory and become critical of some of Freud's and start a new kind of school himself of psychoanalytic psychology. Some of the key works we'll look at today: Civilization and Its Discontents. That's where our reading comes from today. The Interpretation of Dreams. This is Freud's magnum opus, most important work that he wrote, and usually seen to be the most seminal work in his whole body of works. And then, of course, I will mention Moses and monotheism here and there, as I already have.